instructions for the bingo card maker project can be found in our Canvas course site. It really isn't much different from the Lotto Picker assignment we had earlier. I always say the bingo card maker is sort of the Lotto Picker on steroids. Instead of doing 5 numbers that are unique, we're going to do 25, and they're in groups of 5, each in a different range. So go back and look at that Lotto Picker assignment, review your code there, and that'll help you do this project. If you're not familiar with the game of bingo, your goal is to create an application that has the letters BINGO in a label across, and then 5 labels in each column. The B column will have 5 unique numbers between 1 and 15, I between 16 and 30. The N will have 4 unique numbers because the middle space is free, there's no number that goes in there. 4 numbers between 31 and 45. The G will have 5 numbers between 46 and 60, and the O will have 5 numbers between 61 and 75. Again, no duplicates on any of the numbers. And when you test this, you want to make sure that you get the low number in each range. So 1, 16, 31, 46, and 61, and the high in each column being 15, 30, 45, 60, and 75. So you're going to have to probably test this a whole bunch of times to make sure you get no duplicates and that you're getting the full range of numbers. The tips here are the labels. I use auto size property set to false. I set the font to Arial black 36, and then the text alignment center and a border style to fix single. We're going to use loops to make sure there are no duplicates. I would generate the first number in each column and then generate the second number and repeat generating it if it's the same as the first, and then the third number make sure it's not the same as the first or the second, just like we did in the Lotto Picker. And here then is the assessment rubric. Now I've said many times that there are multiple ways to do each project. I'm going to show you the way you're probably going to do it at this point with what you know, and that is we're going to use sequential loops and generate each number, make sure it's not the same as the previous numbers for each of the 5 different columns. Then I want to show you another way to do this using functions, because we're just starting our discussion on functions. I want to demonstrate how this can be a little more efficient using functions. And then in a couple weeks we're going to get into arrays, and we're not quite there yet, but I want to show you how I would do this with arrays, because we can make that even more efficient using arrays. The first methodology, my code is about 105 lines of code. The second one, using the function, it's about 35 lines of code, and the last one using arrays is only about 15, 16 lines of code. So you can see how as we get more and more tools in our tool belt, we can become more efficient in our programming. So stop the video here, try to solve this on your own, and then come back and look at my different solutions. First off, here's my interface. I have a label for making card, and I'm going to show you the 3 different methods of solving this. The first method is going to use what we already know, and that is basically the way we did the Lotto Picker. The second method, I'll use a function and call that function multiple times to reduce some of the redundancy in our code. And then the third method, I'll use arrays to make it even more efficient. We're just starting our discussion on functions, or methods as they might be called, and so this is apropos at this point. The arrays we're going to get into in a couple weeks, and you might want to come back and look at this when we get into arrays. But it'll give you an idea that as you learn more and more about how to code with different approaches, you can become more efficient in your coding. So I have a bunch of labels here with the letters BINGO. Those are not named, but here my labels are named LBLB1, LBLB2, LBLB3, and so forth. LBLI1, I2, LBLN1, LBLN2, LBLG1, LBLO1, down to LBLO5. Let's take a look at the code. In the code, I'm going to start with a random number generator as a global object. So we're calling, naming it R&D and calling new random constructor. We have our form 1 with initializing all the components. That's done for us. And then here is the event handler for our BTN make card click event. And I'm going to have 5 variables, B1, B2, B3, B4, and B5. I'm going to set B1 equal to rnd.next range of 15. This is going to be a number between 0 and 14 randomly. So I'm going to add 1 to it to get a range of 1 to 15. Then in a do while loop, I'm going to use that same formula to generate the value for B2. but I'm going to repeat that while b2 is equal to b1. I don't want a duplicate. Another do while loop. Here we're going to generate that same formula for b3, and I'm going to repeat that while b3 is equal to b1 or b3 is equal to b2. Then we'll do a loop for b4, and here our conditional is repeat that while b4 is equal to b1 or b4 is equal to b2 or b4 is equal to b3, and then the same thing with b5, make sure it's not the same as b1, b2, b3, or b4. Once I've got those 5 unique numbers, I can then output those to my 5 labels, converting those to strings. I simply copy and pasted and did the same thing for the I column and changing all those B's to I's. And be careful as you're doing this that you're very thorough in changing all of the B's to I's so we don't have any B label references here because that will cause problems. I do the same thing for the N column, except here I got rid of the N3 because we don't need it, it's a free space. If you wanted, you could generate the N3 and just ignore it in your output. Here's our G column, going into labels G1 through G5, and then finally our O column. So all told, that's about 105 lines of code. Let's watch this run. So you're going to test this a bunch of times, and as you test it, make sure you're not getting any duplicate numbers. Make sure you're getting the low range of 1, 16, 31, 46, and 61. So I'm not seeing any of those low range numbers. I'm also looking for the high range numbers of 15, 30, 45, 60, and 75. And again, I'm not getting any of those range numbers. So I'm going to generate again. Well, there's my low 1, my low 16, my high 45, my high 60, and my high 75. So I'm still missing a few of the numbers in that range. So I'm going to generate again. And each time, of course, I'm making sure there's no duplicates. Probably going to test this a good dozen times, again, to make sure there are no duplicate numbers. If you make one slight mistake in your code, you may get a duplicate number. So that's where we're going to test it very thoroughly. Let's take a look at the method 2 using a function. Functions are great for allowing us to call repetitive code and reduce the amount of code we have to write. So in this example here for our second method, I'm going to use a function that will be repeated 24 times or called 24 times to generate our number. And to keep track of the numbers that are going to be used, I'm going to have a string called useNumbers that is 76 zeros. Now we're not going to use the first number because there's no index 0 because there's no 0 being generated. But then we have indexes 1 through 75, and that'll keep track of our number. So as we use a number, we're going to change that particular character of that string to an uppercase X. And we'll check to see if that, once we generate a number, if that string character is an X or not. Here's my event handler for that second method. And I'm going to reset useNumbers to those 76 zeros because we're probably going to click this more than once. So useNumbers is a global string or class level string up here. We're just going to reset it here once we've used it. I'm going to call a method that I wrote called getNewNumber. I'm going to pass it a 1. So this is an argument that's being passed to that method. And we're going to put the results from that method that's returned as a string into the text of LBLB1. You notice I'm going to do that 5 times for each of those 5 different B labels, passing it a 1 each time. Let's take a look at the method. So here's the method called getNewNumber. It's going to return a string, and I'm passing it an integer variable that I'm calling range factor. Now that range factor is what I'm adding to the rnd.next of 15. So here rnd.next15 is going to give me a value between 0 and 14. I'm going to add 1 to it. That's what I'm passing to it. It's going to give me a value between 1 and 15. So in this method, I'm having a variable called newNum. I'm going to generate newNum as that rnd.next15 with the range factor. And I'm going to repeat that while usedNumbers, that's my string, character newNum. That's an index to the character. So if I generate a 5, this would be the 6th character or index number 5. Remember, we start with counting with 0. And if it equals an uppercase X, I'm going to regenerate the number. If it doesn't equal an uppercase X, I'm going to set that character to an uppercase X by setting useNumbers to the substring of the elements before that new num, replace it with an x, and then all the values after that new num. And I'm going to return new num as a string. So I'm going to do that 5 times. I'll get my 5 unique numbers between 1 and 15. Doing the same thing for I, except what I'm passing here is a 16. That's going to take my range of 0 to 14, add 16 to it, and I'm going to get 16 to 30 as my range. And then again, checking to see if that number has been used. And if it has, we'll regenerate. Otherwise, we'll mark it as used and display it. For n, I'm only going to pass it 4 times. I'm only going to call it 4 times for n. I don't need the n3, but here I'm passing 31. For the g, 5 times, passing it 46. And for the o, are 5 different o labels, each one passing at 61. So there's about 35 lines of code in this method using our function. And that includes the function. So about 1/3 of the amount of code that we used in the first method. And it's a little more readable. Let's make sure this works. So method 2. Again, I'm going to test it a bunch of times, make sure I get no duplicates, and I'm getting the full range. So there's my high of 15, my high of 45, my low of 61, my low of 1. So I'm going to test this a whole bunch of times using that, make sure that there are no duplicate values, and I'm getting that full range. Let's take a look at the third method, which is going to be to use arrays. So here's my third method. It only has about 15 lines of code. And arrays are simply objects that allow us to have more than one value in them. It's like a variable, but with multiple values. And while we haven't gotten to arrays yet, I just simply want to introduce this as you'll see the value of learning arrays down the road and how much more efficient we can be. So here is my event handler for that third button. I didn't name it anything, still need button 1. I'm creating a array for all of those labels that I can then use or iterate through in a loop. So you'll see I have a label array, and we mark arrays with square brackets. I name it card spaces. It's going to equal LBL B1, LBL B2, B3, and so forth down to LBL 05. So those are my 24 different labels that we're going to generate numbers for. I have another integer array called range factor. This relates to what value do I want to add to my random number generator to get the range from low to high that I'm looking for. So here are all my B's. I'm going to pass 1. Here are all my I's. I'm going to use 16 as my range factor. The N's, 4 of them at 31. 5 46s and 5 61s. I'm also going to create a Boolean array that has 76 values, and I'm going to name it used. This basically replaces that used numbers string that we saw in method number 2. I don't need to initialize this. It's going to be null. I'm just going to check to make sure that it's not true, because as we use the numbers, we'll set the various indexes to true. Variable called mynum, it's an integer, and now I'm going to iterate 24 times through a for loop. And my do is I'm going to generate that R&D next range from 0 to 14 using 15. And I'm going to add to that range factor element I. So the first 5 times it's going to pull a 1. The next 5 times it's going to pull a 16. Because pulling the values for whatever index I is out of range factor. That's going to give me my proper range of random numbers for my num. I'm going to repeat that though while used element my number is true. If it's true, we'll simply repeat it. If it's not true though, I'm going to mark element my number of my used array, that's a Boolean array, to true. So it can't be used again. And then card spaces element I is going to be my label. So my first time, I'm going from 0, LBL B1, I'm going to set the text to mynumber.toString. That will generate our 24 different numbers that are all unique and each within the correct range for the column. And you can see it's about 15 lines of code. So about 1/7 of our first method and a little less than half of our second method. That's the value of arrays. Let's check to make sure this works. So method 3, here I'm getting my range from 1 to 15. I've got a 16 for the low, I've got a 75 for the high over here. Again, no duplicates. I'm going to test this a whole bunch of times, make sure there's no duplicates, and then each low number and each high number comes up in each column. So maybe I'm looking for a 60. There's my 60. Here in the in column, I'm looking for a 45. I'm going to test it. I get a 45. And again, each time I would check to make sure there are no duplicates. May take a while to get a 45. And there it is. So 3 different ways of doing this, each one a little more efficient than the other, but they all work. That's the bottom line. Does your program work? Does it generate the results that you want it to have? If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the C# Xamarin Programming Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.